This is Mae Brussell. It is tape number 860, May the 30th, 1988. Last week I was talking about matters pertaining to the Robert Kennedy assassination and the interesting fact that Marina Oswald had in her diary the name Schicklgruber, Adolf H., and commented upon that. And a long listener to World Watchers went immediately to his own private library, collects books on these matters, and looked up the origin of the Schicklgruber name that he remembered was in the book The Mind of Adolf Hitler. That was written by Walter Langer, and interestingly enough, it was written in 1943 at the request of Wild Bill Donovan, the very year that the Nazis were meeting and deciding to go underground, and also they were working with our OSS and making arrangements for their transfer to America after the war. Then this book was assigned, and the Mind of Adolf Hitler goes into the rantings and ravings of Hitler and says that within 2 years he will commit suicide. They predicted all of that, which of course I don't believe now ever happened. There isn't evidence to support the idea that it happened. But in that same book, The Mind of Adolf Hitler, Mr. Langer, Dr. Langer, has a chapter called The Hitler Family, and he explains the confusion in identifying Hitler's family tree because there was different spellings for the name. There was Hiedler, and when he first joined the Nazi Party, it was Hittler. And in this book, The Mind of Adolf Hitler, on page 110, 111, and page 112, it goes into the fact that his father, Alois Hitler, A-L-O-I-S Hitler, who was his father, was the illegitimate son of a woman named Maria Schicklgruber, Schicklgruber, just the one that was written in Marina's book, the same Schicklgruber, that Alice was the son of this Schicklgruber, and that he was, the book goes on to suggest that he was the illegitimate son of Maria Anna Schicklgruber, and that she married a man, Johann George, G-E-O-R-G, without the Hiedler, but this wasn't, in fact, the father of Adolf Hitler, that Alois Hitler, Hitler's father, had a different father. And this book goes into allegations of two writers, Mr. Tyson and Mr. Kohler, K-O-E-H-L-E-R, that claim that Chancellor Dollfuss of Austria ordered the Austrian police to conduct a thorough investigation to Hitler family when Hitler was getting interested in poking into Austria. As a result of this investigation, a secret document was prepared that proved that Maria Anna Schicklgruber happened to be living in Vienna when she conceived her child, who became Alois Hitler, Hitler's father. At that time, she was employed as a servant in the home of Baron Rothschild. As soon as the family discovered her pregnancy, she was sent back to a home in Speidel, Germany, where Alois was born. If this is true, that one of the Rothschilds is the real father of Alois Hitler, Adolf Hitler's grandfather, it would make Adolf a quarter Jew. But I think even more important, it would explain a lot of the events that happened in his life and how he was funded by the Rothschilds, and the international bankers took an interest in Adolf Hitler immediately following World War I, when they were ready to rearm Germany and put their interest in a particular leader that would get back the monarchies and the wealth of Europe by attacking the evil communism at the other end. And this article says that that according to these sources, Adolf Hitler knew of the existence of the documents of his background and his real grandfather and the incriminating evidence it contained, and that in order to obtain it, he precipitated events in Austria that initiated the assassination of Dollfuss. And then this book goes on to say reasons for supporting this idea is that Johann Hiedler, or George Hiedler, didn't claim his son Alois until 35 years after he was born, and after he had married the mother, and the mother was dead. Then he came forward and said, I'm Alois's father. This is 35 years later. And that if the legacy were left by Hiedler on the condition that Alois take his name, it would have not been possible for him to change it later to Hitler. And then this article goes on to explain that the intelligence and behavior of Alois, Hitler's father, as well as that of his two sons, Adolf and his brother, is completely out of keeping with that usually found in Austrian peasant families. They point out that their ambitiousness and extraordinary political intuition are much more in harmony with the Rothschild tradition, and that Alois Schicklgruber, if he was a Schicklgruber, left his home at an early age and went to Vienna where his mother had worked, and this would be important for his son Alois. And it goes on to say that he lived in Vienna and had friends with people who were Jewish, one family by the name of Prince, that would fit in with the Rothschild connection. So I just thought I'd throw that in because of the name of Schicklgruber and the origin of how Hitler took the name, and maybe he was proud that his grandmother was knocked up by a Rothschild, and maybe that accounts for the way money poured into him. He would have to have the talent to do what he did, but they would willingly pour the money knowing who he is. Now, June the 4th, this week, is the 20th anniversary of the murder of Robert Kennedy. 20 years ago, on May 29th, 1968, Rose Kennedy was here on the Monterey Peninsula. You long listeners and subscribers know this story. Some of you newer ones don't. She was campaigning for Robert Kennedy, and I put a letter in her hand. I said it was a poem because it was John Kennedy's birthday, and I wrote a poem for him. And inside was an envelope explaining how Robert Kennedy would be killed, that there was a scope at the back of his neck, that it would be impossible for him to become president of the United States because they had not exposed the people who killed John Kennedy, and therefore they weren't going to allow Robert to be president either. And, of course, within 6 days, Robert Francis Kennedy was dead. Now, I saw the movie Manchurian Candidate this weekend. I saw it on Saturday, and then I went back again on Sunday because it is filled with symbolism and suggestions and implications that are important to the succession of presidents, how we select our presidents, what happened to John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and even the people that would be president if they could, that have been offed on the way, various ways, subtle but still not around. And we know that the CIA set up assassination teams in May of 1960 with Robert Maheu and Santos Trafficante and Carlos Marcello and John Rosselli and so forth. That included Frank Sturgis, who was at Dealey Plaza. But we also know, or should know, that the CIA was doing mind control experiments well underway by 1953. Now, this movie was the book was written in 1961 by Richard Condon, the Manchurian Candidate, but he had to know a lot about American political methods of how we were going to choose our presidents in the future. And this is very important because we used Klaus Barbie to get rid of the resistance movement in France to make sure that all the leftists along the way were knocked out. And we sent Lucky Luciano to Naples, Italy, to work with Navy intelligence and begin to set up death squads to eliminate political organizers, labor organizers. And Richard Condon wrote this book in 1961. He had to have a lot of knowledge about mind control. And Condon had to know a lot about how mind control would be used, select the candidates for president that the power structure wanted. We don't have a monarchy with succession of people, but out there are these international bankers and people who decided a long time ago. And he knew that mind control was a tool of political assassinations along the way. Now, Richard Condon also wrote what he calls a novel, Winter Kills, which I have, and I'm going to have to read again now, because this story is about the John Kennedy assassination and implies that Joe Kennedy and his father, even with a group of people, wanted him murdered. The book came out in 1974, and on the flyer, the description of Winter Kills, it describes this very important novel, most important of Condon's in 20 years. He touches on the assassination of a president, and they say it's sardonic comedy, satirical. You can imagine how funny it is. And Winter Kills is a stunning addition to legends of violent death of princes. 14 years after the murder of President T. Keegan, K for Kennedy, his extraordinarily wealthy and powerful family, that's Joe Kennedy and his half-brother Nick, learned through a deathbed confession that their beloved president, brother, son, was not killed by a lone psychopath, but the victim of a mysterious conspiracy. And through this book, Condon talks about American mythology, oil kings, movie queens, the Queen of Diamonds, maybe, venal police, the CIA, organized crime. And Winter Kills is about looking into the labyrinth of who really killed the president. And, of course, he comes to the wonderful conclusion that it's his own family. So I have to read it again. But Condon knows a lot. Now, when you see that movie that Frank Sinatra had, and you realize that Sinatra owned the rights to Manchurian Candidate and also another movie I'm going to discuss with you, it makes the movie, of course, much more interesting. Now, Sinatra is the person who arranged for Marilyn Monroe to meet John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. Well, she had some affairs with John Kennedy. It was Robert that she really was very close to. And it was Sinatra who introduced her to the Kennedys through Kennedy's brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, who went to his grave just about a year ago without revealing what really happened, and the Marilyn Monroe calls he was getting when she was dying, and she was calling him. Now, it was the same Frank Sinatra who placed another control on the President of the United States, and that was Judith Exner. And Sinatra owns the movie and stars in the movie Manchurian Candidate, and he was the one who put Judith Exner, the woman who belonged to the mafia, Sam Giancana and John Rosselli, of the CIA, hired by the CIA for death squads. Sinatra is the kingpin, he's still alive, who introduced Exner, who's dying of cancer, and introduced one to bed down with John Kennedy, and the other to be with Robert Kennedy, and that's Marilyn Monroe. Now, there is a book called American Tragedy. I believe it's by Theodore Dreiser. But that isn't what I want to refer to now. I want you to think about what happened in the fact that John Kennedy was gunned down in 1963, and the people who did it got away. In Manchurian Candidate, this person is programmed to assassinate, but there's never police or investigation. And in one matter where he assaults this gentleman from Korea that he recognizes, and they have a bitter fight, and he almost kills him, he's taken to the police department. The police pick him up, and then they call Washington, D.C. to the Army, and the Army releases him. So there's no question of guilt. These people are just killed. And like the Manchurian Candidate, the killers are out large, doing just what they're supposed to do, and there's no question of justice. Now, John Kennedy was gunned down in 63. Robert Kennedy was gunned down in 68. Jack Ruby died of a 3-week cancer in Dallas. And then the opponents of people candidates who would want to be president, opponents possibly of Ronald Reagan's campaign, such as Adlai Stevenson, died of poison, Jacob Javits, of Lou Gehrig's disease, Hubert Humphrey, of poison, Nelson Rockefeller, I believe it was poisoned by Megan Marshak. He died of a mysterious drink of wine and keeled over in New York City. And just as Manchurian Candidate shows the processes of killing various people just up to the point where you can get the candidate select into the place of nomination, we have handled all the would-be people who could be running for president of the United States. Something happens to them. In matter of fact, the week that Joe Biden announced that he was going to run for president of the United States was the week that his embolism started and he had his problems. Lawrence Harvey, who stars in Manchurian Candidate, died of cancer. Marilyn Monroe was murdered. Judith Exner is dying of cancer. Sam Giancana, involved with Sinatra and the CIA and the electoral processes by which bullets decide them, was gunned down in Chicago. John Rosselli was cut up in pieces and put in a drum offshore in Florida, and Lee Harvey Oswald, the patsy, was shot. So there's about 15 deaths just related to this American tragedy around John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and in the ilk or milieu of what the Manchurian Candidate is about. Now, I got the impression after seeing the movie and this past week reading 2 books on Sinatra. I didn't finish the Kitty Kelly, but I went through certain portions that I wanted, looked up in the index, and I'll read more of it later, and then read a full book on Frank Sinatra, another one. And the impression I got is that Frank Sinatra, of course, his whole career in youth, his whole life was tied to the mafia. And the general impression I get is that he was sent into the Kennedy camp to destroy the 2 Kennedys on the guise of being their friends. And if they were linked enough to the mafia, they'd be discredited. And if they disassociated themselves, the mafia would take care of them. And that Sinatra was long friends with a gambling syndicate, the members of Navy intelligence like Luciano and Sam Giancana of the CIA and so forth. And the Cubans, before the Bay of Pigs operation in Cuba, close to the gaming table operators like Frank Sturgis, who came to this country, the associations of Richard Nixon and the Mafia, and Sinatra and the Mafia, are much tighter than any interest that Sinatra would have gung-ho for the presidency of Kennedy in 1960, and then turning against him in 1961. And at that time, this book, not Winter Kills, but Manchurian Candidate, was written, and I believe it could have even been a threat. He told Kennedy he was going to make it, asked him for permission, and to me it was an overt threat to John Kennedy to have it come out this time. Now, Lucky Luciano went to Italy. All of you know the story, or most of you went to Naples. He was released by Tom Dewey, the same man that prosecuted him in New York. Dewey ran for president with Earl Warren, became head of the Warren Commission, and Frank Sinatra was in Cuba in 1947 seeing Luciano, and he also was in Naples seeing Lucky Luciano, and Luciano was in Navy intelligence. Then Sinatra worked closely with the Robert Maheu, Howard Hughes group from Vegas, Maheu of the CIA and FBI that set up the hit teams with Trafficante and friends of Sinatra's. So you get Navy intelligence, CIA, and FBI, and the hub of the Sinatra activity in Cuba happened just before the Bay of Pigs when Castro took over the gaming tables, and Sinatra was part of going to Cuba. His close friends, the Fischetti brothers, were there. They all went down to pay their respects to Luciano in 1947, and these contacts of Richard Nixon and Mafia began very strongly when he got out of the Navy by 1946, and he was put in the House of Representatives by Howard Hughes and ran against Jerry Voorhees. Now, several years later, after Sinatra was in Cuba with these top mafia people, the Kefauver Committee got together in 1950, and Robert Kennedy was showing a inkling or anger at the mafia role in this country already, and there would be no reason for Sinatra to support the two Kennedy brothers. And I might say, as soon as he was severed from John Kennedy, he became the closest friend of Spiro Agnew, who was planning a coup in this country, even to plan to kill Nixon to make himself president. That's Squad 19. And he became very close to Ronald Reagan, and he was married in the home of the Annenbergs. And Sinatra's friends became, as soon as the Kennedys were undone, the very, very right-wing, far right-wing Republicans of the United States. You know, it's one thing to switch parties from Democratic to Republican, but it didn't make sense for him to be so close to Kennedy, but by being close in quotes, he could fix Robert Kennedy up with Marilyn Monroe, and then they proceeded to have her wiretapped, which cut the hands off of Robert Kennedy as the Attorney General in terms of any investigations, then fixed Judith Exner up with John Kennedy, so that the role of Sinatra, arranging these women for the two Kennedy brothers, I don't believe was out of kindness. And when you see the Manchurian Candidate, I had the feeling that Frank Sinatra was even one of those people, just like the fellow who had the lead in the movie that Lawrence Harvey played, because he had a very volatile temper. He would hit people, sock them. He wasn't sociable, and for somebody who was so successful, he was like a time bomb, always going off, always fighting, and so forth. So in the milieu of Luciano, Navy intelligence, Maheu, Rosselli, Giancana, CIA, we have somebody like Sinatra very close to them, and one of his closest relationships, described well by Kitty Kelly's, was Sam Giancana, who before the CIA found him good enough to hire, had proved his bona fides by killing at least 200 people. Then he was qualified to work for the CIA. Now, in 47, as I say, Sinatra was in Naples, he was in Cuba with Luciano, he was with Carlos Marcello, and all the top mafiosa. But an interesting thing happened in his career in 1953, and that's important. Manchurian Candidate was written in 61, made into a film in 62. In 1953, Frank Sinatra made a movie called Suddenly. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. I don't even remember the movie Suddenly. But it's a movie that he made, and it's about the murder of a president of the United States. And in Kitty Kelly's book on Sinatra, she said that Frank Sinatra literally owned Suddenly, which is the murder of a president, and he owned Manchurian Candidate. Both of them were taken off the screen as soon as John Kennedy had been murdered, but Suddenly was made in 1953. And in Irving, Texas, a little suburb outside of Dallas, Texas, where Lee Oswald had rented a rooming house, the movie, suddenly, the Frank Sinatra movie, was playing November the 20th, 1963. And Lee Harvey Oswald went to see that movie. It was 10 years old, and it just happens to be showing on the murder of the president the very week, 2 days before the president is to arrive in the United States. Now, I don't hold that Lee Harvey Oswald shot the president, but I believe he was a zombie walking around to become a patsy. In the Manchurian Candidate, there's about 13 people who are rounded up by the Koreans and taken to Manchuria. And Manchuria, in that time period, is where Charles Willoughby was working with Japanese experiments. Remember, after the war, where they were experimenting on Americans and doing all kinds of work on them and shooting them when their legs were frozen and so forth. But Manchuria was an area of experimentation by the Japanese that the United States decided to use that evidence and experimentation for our own purposes. When the story came out last week that somebody from the University of Minnesota was going to use Nazi files of medical experiments, there was a little bit of a ruckus about it. But nobody talks about Charles Willoughby, whose name is Karl Wiedenbach. I wrote about him in my Rebel article on the Nazi links to the Kennedy assassination, and he was the one that wanted to save the Manchurian experiments done by the Japanese up till 1945, so it would be easy to be continuing those operations and experiments in that area. And according to this story, the Koreans took these fellows during the Korean War up to Manchuria, but it could be the South Koreans that took them up to Manchuria, where we had done accepted the experiments of the Japanese at that time. Now, knowing that this book suddenly came out in 1953, I looked up when our mind control programs would be taking place, because it's important to go back to what the meaning was that Sinatra made both of these films, owned both of these films. Oswald went to see one. So I got out my joint hearings before the Select Committee on Intelligence and the Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research. The hearings began August 3, 1977. Project MK Ultra, the CIA's program of research into behavioral modification. And I have a whole book on the subject. I'm not going into it now, but the first operations were Project Chatter, a Navy program that started in the fall of 1947 with amazing results on truth, drugs, overseas experiments, and so forth. And in 1947 is when Sinatra went to see Luciano, and lucky Luciano was working for Navy intelligence, and we were working over there in Italy and with Navy intelligence on mind control experiments. So the question is, was Sinatra himself, has he always been a time bomb, making these movies, bedding these people down with each other, being used as a conduit so that, say, if Richard Nixon was selected heir to be president, which I alleged in my first published article about him, right after Navy intelligence, and then he ran against Jerry Voorhees in the House, and then the Senate against Helen Douglas, and then he became the vice president for 8 years. And I felt that, when he ran in 1960, if he didn't win, then the person he ran against could be killed and he could get back into office, back on track. So 1947 is when Project Chatter began, and Project Bluebird Artichoke began in 1950. The CIA director began that for memory enhancement, and also you could reduce the memory, and mind control and biological experiments and chemical experiments on Americans in 1950. And that movie on the assassination was made in 1953. The Office of Scientific Intelligence, OSI, studied scientific advancements, and their excuse was hostile powers. They led Bluebird Artichoke experiments, and in 1952, the responsibility for Artichoke was transferred from OSI to the Inspection and Security Office, and MK Naomi began then, and these were more experiments done in the 50s, and in 1952, for covert use and clandestine meetings, and for the TDS, Technical Services Division, and Biological Material. And these mind control programs were done at Fort Detrick in 1952. And in 1953, Sinatra is making this movie, as I say, about the assassination of a president. Probably, I don't know if it is or not, the first picture since World War II of the murder of a president of the United States made by Sinatra that Oswald's going to see 10 years later. And we were well into mind control programs from 47 to 1952 when that was made. Now, in 1952, Frank Sinatra had a friend in Las Vegas. His name was Jack Entratter, and he wanted Sinatra to sing at his hotel, but at the Sands Hotel, but Sinatra couldn't do it. He was singing at the Flamingo Hotel instead. And then all of a sudden, the owner of the Flamingo, Gus Greenbaum, and his wife, according to this book on Sinatra, mysteriously are slashed to death in Phoenix. The murders are never solved, again like Manchurian Candidate. The only rule in Vegas is kill out of town. Don't kill in Vegas. And this book on Sinatra said Greenbaum evidently knew too much about somebody in Vegas. His wife must have known the killer. And, of course, as soon as they are dead and Frank had his contract with them at the Sands Hotel, then he can move to the Flamingo because the boss is dead. And in 1953, he was given the presidential suite. They had a great special presidential suite, and he stayed there, and he stayed there at the very time that he was making a movie on the murder of the president that Oswald is going to see just before the assassination. The movie is called Suddenly, produced, it came out in 1954. What I'm talking about preceded the the filming went on in 53, and then the final date on it is 54. And the description of the movie says Sinatra led a trio of paid assassins who take over a house in a small town where the president will pass on his way to a fishing trip. White knuckle thriller with Sinatra, excellent and thoroughly detestable role. The rest of the cast is equally fine. Suddenly, incidentally, is the name of the town. So I just thought I'd share that with you because we may have to look up these video services that have these obscure movies. It isn't one that we think about all the time, but is one that Frank Sinatra took off of circulation after Kennedy was killed, just as he took off Manchurian Candidate. And Frank's friends not only mysteriously disappeared when he had contracts with them and his mentor wanted him somewhere else, but he was very close, as they say, Giancana, who had done at least 200 murders. And in 1954, the year that he made Suddenly, that it came out, he was very, very close to Bugsy Siegel, who is described in the books on Sinatra as the Mafia Chief for Murder Incorporated. So Lucky Luciano of New York Murder Incorporated was prosecuted, put in jail, and released by the man who prosecuted him for Navy intelligence, Luciana. Sinatra's in Naples with Luciana. He's in Cuba with Luciana. He's in Hollywood with Bugsy Siegel of Murder Incorporated. And I don't believe when we hear stories that the Mafia killed John Kennedy, that is the main story. The main story is Luciana, Navy intelligence, Maheu, CIA, that the government agencies keep control of the candidates by letting the Mafia do the murders, and in return they don't get prosecuted for any of the killings. They look the other way. So as I say, try and find, suddenly we'll all look for that and see about the psychopathic assassin who guns down the president. Now, there were a lot of articles, of course, about Frank Sinatra's being close to organized crime and crime figures. And when Ronald Reagan came into office, there were stories about the Rat Pack comes back and the role of these various mafia figures around Sinatra, who now is close to Ronald Reagan as soon as the two Kennedys are killed, or before, after John Kennedy dies, he beds up, and certainly after Robert Kennedy, he's very, very close then to Spiro Agnew and to Richard Nixon and the powers that be, all the right-wing conservatives. But one article I have about Sinatra and his career said that when he wanted in the 1950s to make a comeback in the movie From Here to Eternity, Mr. Harry Cohn at Columbia didn't want him to have the part. So what happened was, according to this article, the method they used that was later fictionalized in The Godfather, they put that famous horse's head that was cut off in the bed to scare Harry Cohn and give the part to Frank Sinatra, implying this will be you, and going to bed and finding the horse's head. According to this article I have, this is what happened to get Sinatra the role From Here to Eternity, and it was used against Harry Cohn. And with that, we'll just take a 1-second break, turn over the tape, and then I'll continue the thread, or what I believe was a thread, right from that point on that Sinatra then gave to John Kennedy by making the Manchurian Candidate. This is Mae Brussell. It is side 2 of tape number 860, May the 30th, 1988. Now, I wrote my first published article about Nixon being the selected heir to the presidency and his long role with the mafia and Maheu and Howard Hughes and so forth. And in the Manchurian Candidate, the team of people that are brainwashed have to watch a demonstration where they sit in a row of chairs, and one person is selected to choke the person he likes the best and then shoot another one in the head. And the men who are selected as the victims just sit there, and they don't have any response to their own murder. They're already zonked out so that they can be used for various operations and then wiped out, and they can't fight their murderer. And then in the course of the movie, a newspaper man from the New York Times is murdered, and it turns out that he's writing exposés of the selected candidate who would be president of the United States. And then the brain-controlled candidate, the Manchurian candidate, for the job of helping eliminate people until they get their chosen president, he kills his own girlfriend and he kills her father, who was an opponent of the selected candidate. So along the way, they are working their way up until the very worst person, who has had the political ambitions all along, will necessarily become the president, because those who interfere with the activities on the outside can be eliminated. Now, in 1960, while Sinatra was close to John Kennedy, he was raising money for his presidency, and he was getting money in New Jersey, putting on shows, and in Nevada and other places. There were reports that John Kennedy was going to dump Sinatra, and his friendship, and Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, felt with the political advisors that they should sack Sinatra, that he was too linked to the organized crime, and Sinatra's political romance with Kennedy began to end. He went to the inauguration, put on the inauguration ball, but the feelings towards John Kennedy were being severed just even before Kennedy was inaugurated. And Sinatra was very upset by this, and they were cutting him down because of his reputation with Giancana and the mafia. And Sinatra was close to Peter Lawford. Lawford was married to John Kennedy's sister. In this one book, Evan Sinatra, it tells about Dorothy Kilgallen, who was notoriously anti-Sinatra, and it gave me a different view of why Dorothy Kilgallen died right after she saw Jack Ruby, because she may have had some information from Ruby about those very people that surrounded Jack Kennedy and literally got away with it. And so, again, the newspaper person has to be gunned down. The media person is gunned down. So the legend that Sinatra was embarrassing the Kennedys was beginning in the 60s. And in 1960, Sinatra was making a movie with Janet Leigh. And in 62, 2 years later, she becomes one of the stars of Manchurian Candidate. And according to accounts, I have the menace of Bobby Kennedy as the Attorney General was always before him, the crusading Kennedy, all-powerful, ruthless, unstoppable. And as soon as he was sworn in as Attorney General, he was determined to get the mobsters out of Vegas, to run the mafia out of the country. And Kennedy wrote a book against the mafia called The Enemy Within, and about the mafia. And he was crusading. So in 1961, when this book was written by Mr. Condon, the Manchurian Candidate, is when all of the friction was taking place between Frank Sinatra and Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy, and the people around Kennedy were suspicious of Sinatra. Now, Sinatra, for all purposes, wanted to get even. That's what I believe he wanted to do. And I believe that a good way to get even with him would be to fix Bobby Kennedy up with Marilyn Monroe, and then have Marilyn killed and sacrificed, which incidentally I'll do a little bit on the Queen of Diamonds and Queen of Spades. I believe the Queen of Diamonds, a Manchurian Candidate, was Marilyn Monroe, and they were, at the time the movie was made, of course, Marilyn was very much a part of their lives in Hollywood. And then the other part of fixing Judith Exner up with John Kennedy was the perfect vengeance. Now, I don't believe now the story that he just fixed them up to be nice because he liked them. I believe that Sinatra, placed like the movie Manchurian Candidate, was placed in society to unload the two Kennedy brothers. And shortly after Kennedy was in office, he removed the troops from the Bay of Pigs, and of course all the gambling syndicate wanted to get back to Cuba and continue their operations, which Kennedy had interrupted by allowing Fidel Castro to live. So Sinatra was in a key position to bring down both Kennedys with the cunts, I should say. One, Marilyn Monroe with Robert Kennedy, and Judith Exner at the other end, that would be detrimental to their reputations, to their welfare, and then later when they're killed would lend a lot of mystique to what were they doing with these people, how were they fixed up, and of course Sinatra was the kingpin in fixing both of those up. And Sinatra went to Hyannisport, September 23rd, 1961. Manchurian Candidate came out about that time, and he saw John Kennedy there. John Kennedy flew into there with Pat Lawford. His brother-in-law, Ted Kennedy, was there. And then he asked to go to Washington, D.C., because he wanted to talk about the mafia connections that Robert Kennedy was attacking them on. And Lawford begged Robert Kennedy to listen for Sinatra's pleas for Sam Giancana, and Robert Kennedy intended to make Frank's mobster friend the Justice Department's top priority in Chicago. This comes from Kitty Kelly's book, His Way, the Unauthorized Biography of Frank Sinatra, and it tells how Sinatra goes in 1961 to Washington, D.C., with Peter Lawford to say, would you get off our backs, get off of Giancana's back, and Robert Kennedy's priority at that time was to go after Giancana and the Chicago Mafia. And in this book by Kitty Kelly, it goes on to say then, he then told the president, this is Frank, he then told the president about his interest in making the Manchurian Candidate. And that is what I think was the threat to President John Kennedy. If you don't do what I asked you to, I was at Hyannisport, I was at the Justice Department, I'm going to make the movie The Manchurian Candidate a psychological thriller based on a novel by Richard Condon about two American soldiers who were captured by the communists during the Korean War and brainwashed. One of the soldiers, Lawrence Harvey, is programmed to assassinate a presidential candidate so that the communist-backed candidate will become president. But it could be the other way around, that we are using Navy intelligence, CIA, to put in the fascist Nazi president and saying that the Koreans are doing the mind control when we had all the mind control programs going full speed by 1947 and certainly by 50, 61, 62, and so forth. So Frank Sinatra said that he was going to play a part in the movie, be played by him, and the other soldier, Frank Sinatra's role, is deprogrammed by a psychiatrist, and they work with the FBI to investigate Harvey. Frank explained what he was going to do, that he was going to make the movie, and he approached with the property of George Axelrod and John Frankenheimer, who were going to make the film, and it would be distributed by United Artists as part of a $15 million contract Frank had with the company. The problem was that Arthur Krim, president of United Artists, refused to distribute the movie. He was finance chairman of the Democratic Party at the time. He was protective of the Kennedy family. He felt the movie was too politically explosive, and Frank disagreed with him and took the matter himself to John Kennedy. So he got permission. He said, I'm going to make a movie on how a president is killed, and by making it be that the Koreans brainwashed somebody from Moscow for the Pavlov Institute, instead of that the CIA and Navy intelligence brainwashed various people for the murder of our own president. I feel it was a veiled threat, just as Sinatra, if the allegations are true, or his friends had arranged for the head in the bed of Mr. Harry Cohn, and he got the part that he did very well in From Here to Eternity. I feel that this was a threat that followed his close associations with this particular hatred of the Kennedys and the Justice Department, and I feel that this threat was to say to John Kennedy, I've had it up to here, I'm going to make the movie, and the movie came out in 1963, the same year as the assassination. Now, Frank had a close relationship with Joe DiMaggio, who's married to Marilyn Monroe. It was after Marilyn divorced DiMaggio that she moved into Frank Sinatra's home, and then they introduced her to Robert Kennedy, and that part is fairly good history. But DiMaggio and Sinatra had wanted to break into Marilyn's apartment. DiMaggio was mad about the divorce, and they heard that Marilyn had a lesbian affair, and they were going to break down the door. It was known as the Wrong Door Raid, and find her with a lesbian. Then DiMaggio could criticize her and save his masculinity by saying, she doesn't like me, Mr. Macho. DiMaggio, see, because she's with a lesbian. Well, it turned out she wasn't with a lesbian, and they tore down the door of the wrong woman in an apartment, and they were sued and went to court, and one of the attorneys for these guys was Sidney Korshak, who also is a well-known attorney for the mafia and represents Frank Sinatra frequently. But the interesting part of this story in Kitty Kelly's book says Frank hired Fred Otash, O-T-A-S-H, a private detective, to try and prove that he did not perjure himself in the State Senate committee when they were investigating it. By the time the grand jury convened, Frank and his friends had their previously divergent stories straightened out. He testified for 50 minutes, sticking to the story he gave one party, the State Senate committee, and he escaped indictment and perjury, and he was able to get off this charge of the allegations or the defending of himself that would prove he was involved in knocking the door down. And then this book says DiMaggio and Monroe had been divorced several months. Frank Sinatra started dating Marilyn Monroe, passed her around to her friends. Joe DiMaggio never forgave Frank Sinatra or Peter Lawford for allowing Marilyn Monroe's affair with Robert Kennedy to take place. He was bitter about them, and after her suicide, in quotes, he forbid them from attending her funeral in 1962. And also Sinatra was forbidden from attending the funeral of John Kennedy in 1963. Now, that investigator, Fred Otash, worked protecting or looking into information for Frank Sinatra, going back to that other time period where Sinatra is setting her up with Robert Kennedy. And then in the book Goddess by Anthony Summers, published by Macmillan in 1985, this book goes into great length about the murder of Marilyn Monroe and her relationship with the Kennedys and Peter Lawford. And I'm not going into the bulk of this book now. I never have touched on the programs. But in this book, they suggest that somebody put her in an ambulance and she started to go to the hospital, but she was dead. And so the circumstances were such that they brought her back to the house. And Anthony Summers said that now time was needed above all to allow Robert Kennedy to slip out of town, that he was there with her when this was going on, when the body was returned to Brentwood. It was time for a cleanup operation at Marilyn's house. Only when all this had been accomplished did they call out to Dr. Greenson, her psychiatrist, who came to discover the body between 3:30 and 4. As the trail followed by reporters, Himes and Woodfield indicates, as the trail followed, and as described by Peter Lawford to his third wife, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, left for Northern California. He was supposed to go back to Gilroy, nearby Carmel, by air. Meanwhile, as he told Gould, Peter Lawford destroyed some compromising documents, probably a half-written letter, rather than a suicide note, and commissioned private detective Fred Otash to sweep dust over whatever telltale tracks would remain in Marilyn's bedroom. In any event, Otash and associates were able to do very little. By the time they were activated early on Sunday, some more powerful wheels had been set into motion. The reason I share this with you is that the private investigator that Frank Sinatra used for his various mischief and to get him out of court problems was this Mr. Otash. And it's the identical person who was called, Sinatra's investigator is called by somebody to Peter Lawford in this case to clean out Marilyn's place and sanitize it before the people come that could pick up some more clues about how she died or phone calls or letters or whatever. So Marilyn had that in Marilyn's death, had that in common with the early Sinatra investigator and then with Peter Lawford, who had connected her to the Kennedys. And this book suggests that Robert Kennedy was in town. And also Kitty Kelly's book, His Way, the unauthorized biography of Frank Sinatra, goes into some emotional problems that Sinatra had at one time. And I'm not sure how much he was under mind control. When you see Sinatra now, to me, he's a walking version of a possible Candy Jones. And one reason I got interested in Manchurian Candidate, I would have seen it anyway coming out in the subject matter. But when I saw him in Larry King's, I think I mentioned on the tape, I really thought something was drastically wrong. Larry King asked him about his releasing this movie at this time, and the subject of the movie suddenly didn't come up at all. And Frank Sinatra just looked dazed and said, well, I taped it off the air, but just to paraphrase it, like, I don't know I had it. I didn't know how I owned it. My business people buy these things. And there was no comment about his former friend John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Marilyn Monroe or the dying Judith Exner. All those people are just a blur. If Sinatra wouldn't, of course, mention their name, Giancana, Rosselli, all the people dead around these people. And Sinatra looked very much like he was under mind control. And in Kitty Kelly's book, she says on page 208, Sinatra was having problems, a relationship, his friendship with one particular person was going to end unless he promised to get psychiatric care. So Frank agreed, and upon his return to Los Angeles, he began to see Dr. Harry Romney Greenson. Now, this was the psychiatrist for Frank Sinatra, and this is also the very controversial psychiatrist later for Marilyn Monroe. For the day she died, she allegedly had needle marks in her arm. She'd gone to see Greenson, and this was Marilyn Monroe's psychiatrist also. And according to this book, he's the brother-in-law of Milton Rudin, the attorney for Frank Sinatra. And Greenson, I always have these amazing neighbors that live next to me. They never end. But Dr. Greenson lived down on Walden Drive, the same block as my parents, about 5-6 houses down. And his son went to private school where my son went. And then all of a sudden, when I'm studying this history, I see this is Marilyn's, I call it the fatal psychiatrist, and he was Frank Sinatra's psychiatrist. So Frank had a control, a Manchurian candidate control with his investigator Otesh, who also sanitized when Marilyn was dead, with a psychiatrist, who was his psychiatrist, who Marilyn went to. And it just seems that these people traveled not only in the same circle, but they had some relationship that we haven't really outlined yet clearly enough to know where the connections are between these people and how much these were Manchurian candidate murders, all for the purpose, one, of discrediting Robert Kennedy, who would be murdered in 1968, who wanted to be president, and one for murdering John Kennedy in 1963 and embarrassing the family with the various people that the boys had been fixed up. Sure, they walked into the trap, but it's pretty bad. In this book, Goddess, it tells how Greenson tried to talk to Marilyn, and she was teetering and having problems with drugs and despair. And she called Robert Kennedy, and she was frantic, and called Peter Lawford, and couldn't get Kennedy to come to her place. And so Marilyn was traveling psychologically between Greenson and Kennedy and Peter Lawford. And all of these people only came into being actually through Frank Sinatra, the investigators and so forth. So the web of these people would be just about as clearly defined as anything you could see in the way they connect to each other, erase each other, and compare it to the movie The Manchurian Candidate. Now, in a book on Frank Sinatra, several books that I've been reading, it tells about the relationship of Jackie Onassis with Frank Sinatra, and there's a picture of Jackie Onassis in the book, The Unauthorized Biography of Sinatra, looking very beautiful, and he's escorting her to the inaugural ball in 1960. Remember, Sinatra put on the inaugural ball for the Reagans in 1981, and so it's 1961, and he's taking her to her box for the pre-inauguration gala. It's the night before the inauguration, and he wouldn't have it at the Kennedy Center. He hated the Kennedys so much that he refused to have this entertainment that he was setting up at the Kennedy Center. Now, Jackie looks very happy and very beautiful, and she's on the arm of Frank Sinatra, who was a well-known actor. And certainly by 1961, when they were sworn in January 61, there was a lot of information about the links of Sinatra with Luciano, again, of Navy intelligence, and Maheu's connections, FBI, CIA, working right with Schicklgruber and those people with Luciano, not only Luciano, but Trafficante and John Rosselli and Carlos Marcello, the hit teams that they're going to use to wipe out persons that eventually took them all around the world. So here is Jackie Onassis, Jackie Kennedy at the time, very happy in the arms of Frank Sinatra. Now that's okay. Going back to 1961, she could have known and gotten better entertainment for the inauguration, I believe, but maybe they were indebted to Sinatra for getting all the votes he did. But when you get one time step further, to September 8th, 1975, Jacqueline Onassis has long been a widow, and a lot has happened. The two Kennedy brothers are dead, and Marilyn's dead, and Frank Sinatra wants to make a comeback in New York City. And he wants to go to the Uris Theater where he'd make $1 million in 2 weeks. His reputation is sliding. So he signs up for the Uris Theater for an engagement that turned out to be a triumph for him. It made a lot of money. And in the book Sinatra by Earl Wilson, it said that it grossed in 2 weeks $1,088,000. It was a social success because on Wednesday night, what made it such a success right after it opened was Jacqueline Onassis came to the theater as Sinatra's date for the evening. Now, this is the man that was fixing Judith Exner up with her husband, John Kennedy. And visualize Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, having married Aristotle Onassis, being the escort of Frank Sinatra in New York City, making him a hit again. Wouldn't a woman be angry at a man who fixes her husband up with Sam Giancana? And the House Select Committee began investigations in 1975, just around this time period, where all this stuff about Giancana came out, and John Rosselli and Judith Exner, and how Exner would go into the White House, leave her little panties under the pillow, and sleep there for a while, and then go down to Florida and be with mobster Sam Giancana. And all of this is going on. Jacqueline Kennedy, it seems to me, just as a woman, would be very angry, very, very angry, and not be dating socially Frank Sinatra, the man that set up Robert Kennedy with Marilyn Monroe and John Kennedy with Judith Exner. And according to this book, she came to the theater September 17th. Jackie came to the theater as Sinatra's date in the evening. This coup to theater was Jackie Onassis' own idea. It was early in her widowhood, and she had not been seen around town. Poor thing. The night before, Frank had made a supper reservation for the 17th for himself and for Jackie and Peter Duchens. The word was spread versus Carroll's, the man who wrote the book, Earl Wilson, rather, his column about this dinner date, and he said that Jackie would be coming to see his concert. Jackie had the same kind of magic Sinatra had. Rumors flew. A Sinatra intimate had been saying Frank Sinatra and Jackie would be a perfect match. And Sinatra's friend Barbara Marx, who he eventually shortly afterwards married, flew into New York shortly afterwards. Jackie was coming without an escort. She was being picked up by Frank Sinatra's plain-spoken pal, Gilly Rizzo. Now, the character George de Mohrenschildt, with these strong links to Nazis and Nazi intelligence during World War II, who was the mentor, the intelligence person in charge of Lee and Marina Oswald, had been at the home of Jacqueline Bouvier when she was a child, at the home of her parents, the Auchenschloss, saw her as a child, and de Mohrenschildt had this contact with Jackie and then played a role in the murder of John Kennedy. And Sinatra had the contact between Robert Kennedy, who was dead, died in 1968, this is 1975, and John Kennedy. And the question is, why would she so willingly socialize or want to make Sinatra a hit? And she's picked up by, I don't know if Gilly Rizzo is one of his mafia gangsters or who he is, but that's the guy that picked up Jacqueline and took her to the theater. And according to this book, there was a mob scene, a carnival atmosphere at the Uris Theater. And wearing a simple black pants outfit, Jackie sat in the fourth row with Peter Duchen and his wife, and she and Duchen joined a standing ovation and returned to Sinatra's dressing room after the concert, with Sinatra's right hand encircling Jackie's left wrist and Gilly Rizzo shoulder to shoulder with him. On the other side, they went off to Club 21. And there's a picture in the book, My Way, Kitty Kelly's book, Jacqueline Onassis with her arm, Sinatra's arm around her, going to Club 21 after she leaves his concert. And there's a picture of his friend Gilly Rizzo, the driver. And then that wasn't enough that they went to 21, but Jackie decided that they should go out at midnight to the Rainbow Grill of the RCA building, 65 floors up, and they went to a show there, and they were very visible in town. And it's sort of like saying, I approve of what you did. And the question was, I'm going to ask the hard question, were all these people used to make the two Kennedy brothers expendable? Now, Jacqueline Kennedy's sister married this Count Radziwill, who was a Polish, allegedly a heir to the throne of Poland when the monarchy were removed. And they were far, far right people. And the question of these widows, widowhood, I go back to the Queen of Spades, which in tarot cards is a widow. And Lee Harvey Oswald is coming home. He's seen this opera, The Queen of Spades by Tchaikovsky, and he's written a section from that aria about that he's going to do something very heroic. And maybe the heroism in this case is to wipe out the leftist, the commie simp kind of people like John Kennedy. After all, didn't he pull back from Cuba and didn't kill Castro and so forth? And there's Lee Harvey Oswald holding the Queen of Spades. Now, one other item about Jacqueline Onassis, the mysterious Onassis. I've referred to her through the years, but not as much as I should have. There was an article July 28th, 1986, about the law office of Simon Rifkin. That office always interests me because he was in charge of the Sterling Bank and a lot of other important connections to David Graver, who worked with Rowell, who set up James Earl Ray and so forth. But in this article, it said Simon Rifkin's son, that's the attorney, and his law partner, Arthur Lyman, was the chief counsel for the investigation of the Iran-Contra affair, who made a whole circus out of that. And the only one he was a tough on was Albert Hakim, because he's a little Iranian Jew. The rest all got off very easy. Rifkin's son is chairman of the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research. And I always worry about this cancer and links to these high-up people in these administrations. His other son, Robert, is a litigator at Texaco's lead law firm. In the Pennzoil case, he was involved in that. In 1950, Rifkin, it's saying, he resigned and joined Paul Weiss firm, then a fledgling concern with virtually no litigation practice. And Rifkin was a federal judge and earned $15,000 a year. And in 1950, joined this other firm. And in 1950, as I say, from 47 on, we were heavily into mind control. And in 53, there was the murder of the president, that movie. And this article says Simon Rifkin brought a libel action against Walter Winchell for branding New York Post editor James Wessler a communist. And he also represented Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the wife of the Chinese nationalist leader. Well, Madame Chiang is also the wife of the great drug dealer Chiang Kai-shek of the Kuomintang. He was also known, his best-known private practice, as the attorney for Jacqueline Kennedy and for her lawyer in an effort to have portions deleted from William Manchester's book about her husband and President John Kennedy. As a matter of fact, this summer, Caroline Kennedy, who just graduated from Columbia Law School last week, was doing apprentice work in the office of Arthur Lyman. And this company represented Jacqueline Onassis, Jacqueline Kennedy then, from stopping Manchester putting things in his book. Manchester was working hard on the book on the murder of Kennedy, and then he, I understand, had a nervous breakdown and was forced to go into a mental hospital. And when he came out, the book, of course, ended up being a Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. And Rifkin worked and represented Jacqueline Kennedy, and that was interesting considering he also represented Chiang Kai-shek. So Rifkin was against Walter Winchell. He was for Madame Chiang Kai-shek. He represented Jacqueline Kennedy against William Manchester. He also represented Adlai Stevenson, a presidential candidate who died and was poisoned before he ever got any nomination. And he was representing Justice Goldberg, who resigned so Nixon could stack the Supreme Court with his own particular fascists. And he hired Ramsey Clark, who said there was no conspiracy in the case to kill Martin Luther King. And his law firm also hired Ted Sorensen, who said that it's time to do away with the Constitution and have one election where the president is 6 years. And his office has Arthur Lyman, who represented the House Intelligence, Senate Intelligence, for the dismal display that they did. And they also represent Robert Vesco, the partner and client of Willard Zucker over in Switzerland, that is the source of money for the enterprise. So these people weave in and out, working together through the years. And I may get back later some more Manchurian Candidate. It's a very, very interesting movie. I recommend you see it, and I'm going to try and get the paperback this week. But I think I've given you a lot to think about, and I see Sinatra's role with the introduction of these ladies as being something sinister, going from heavy mafia connections to entrap and get rid of the two Kennedys, and then join Agnew and Nixon and Reagan, where he really belongs as the corporate head of the corporation representing the mafia interests. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week. Thank you for the articles you're sending in books, and keep up clipping for me. I appreciate it very much.